Jonathan Harley did not return home immediately after leaving the lawyer's office. Instead, he drove aimlessly through streets he had once helped shape through business deals and silent influence, but now they felt unfamiliar, almost hostile, as if the city itself had shifted its posture toward him. The buildings he once owned outright now looked like witnesses rather than assets, standing tall and unmoved while his certainty crumbled. Every traffic light felt like a pause for judgment. Every reflection in the windshield a reminder of how carefully Eleanor had stepped ahead of him, while appearing to remain behind. He replayed moments from their marriage, searching desperately for signs he had ignored her quiet pauses before responding. A habit of rereading documents he skimmed. The way she asked questions that seemed casual, but were never careless. For decades, he had mistaken her restraint for absence, never realizing she was collecting truths the way others collected power, patiently, methodically, without announcing her intentions. When Jonathan finally returned to the house, the silence greeted him not as emptiness but as presence. It pressed against him, thick and deliberate, filling every corridor with memory. He walked through rooms slowly, touching furniture he had once chosen without consulting Eleanor, suddenly aware that she had allowed those choices not because she lacked opinion, but because she was planning something far larger than decor or control. In the study he stood before her portrait again, and this time he did not look away. He noticed details he had never cared to see before: the intelligence in her eyes, the firmness hidden beneath softness, the suggestion of patience rather than submission. For the first time, he felt watched not by accusation, but by understanding, and that frightened him far more than anger ever could. Days passed, then weeks, and the unraveling continued with relentless precision. Financial institutions contacted him, not with sympathy, but with formal restraint, each conversation tightening the invisible net Eleanor had woven years ago. Partnerships dissolved politely. Invitations stopped arriving. His name, once synonymous with quiet authority, now carried a subtle asterisk and unspoken caution. He learned that Eleanor had arranged everything to unfold gradually, not out of cruelty, but certainty. She had not wanted him ruined overnight. She had wanted him to understand. That realization settled heavily on him one evening, as he sat alone at the dining table meant for 12. Eating a meal he barely tasted, surrounded by chairs that felt like an audience waiting for a confession he could not make. Meanwhile, Margaret Lewis moved through Eleanor's world with a sense of reverence and responsibility that surprised even herself. Each document she reviewed, each recording she catalogued, revealed a woman far more complex than the one society remembered. Eleanor had built networks quietly, supported initiatives anonymously, and guided decisions without attaching her name, all while allowing Jonathan to believe he was the sole architect of their shared life. Margaret understood then that Eleanor's greatest strength had been her ability to let others underestimate her without ever correcting them. It was not bitterness that fueled Eleanor's planning, but clarity, the kind that comes from seeing people exactly as they are and preparing accordingly. The foundation grew quickly once it became public, not because of scandal, but because of trust. People who had benefited from Eleanor's unseen generosity stepped forward with stories that reframed her entire existence. Teachers spoke of programs that saved schools from closure. Entrepreneurs credited anonymous grants for their survival. Families remembered moments of help that arrived without explanation or expectation. Jonathan watched these stories unfold from the margins, slowly realizing that Eleanor's legacy was not reactive to his betrayal, but independent of it. She had not built her future around correcting him. She had built it around purpose, and that distinction left him hollow. One evening, unable to remain in the house any longer, Jonathan packed a single suitcase and left without ceremony. There was no dramatic exit, no confrontation, no final word. The house did not resist his departure, nor did it mourn him. As he closed the door behind him, he understood that Eleanor had already said everything she needed to say. not through anger or accusation, but through preparation. She had spoken in clauses and foresight, in patience and restraint, and now her voice echoed far louder than his ever had. Years later, Jonathan would live quietly, stripped of titles but not of memory. He would tell no one his story, not because he feared judgment, but because he finally understood it. He had believed power was something seized, declared, enforced. Eleanor had known it was something built silently and released only when necessary. In the end, the will had never been the true instrument of her plan. It was merely the trigger. The real legacy was awareness, and that was the one detail Jonathan could never undo. And so, long after the legal documents were finalized and the estate redistributed, Eleanor Hale's presence remained, not in property or wealth, but in the lives she shaped without announcement. Jonathan changed the will in secret, believing control lived in ink and signatures, but he missed the one detail that mattered most. Eleanor had already written the ending long before he thought the story was his to command. Jonathan's life after leaving the house did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it thinned out slowly, like ink fading from an old document left in the sun. He moved into a small furnished apartment on the edge of the city, a place chosen not for comfort but anonymity, where no one recognized his name, and no one asked about his past. Each morning he woke to unfamiliar sounds, neighbors leaving for work, traffic humming without pause, and for the first time in decades, no one waited for his decisions. The absence of influence unsettled him more than loss of wealth ever could. He discovered that money had insulated him from silence, and without it, his thoughts grew louder, more demanding, forcing him to confront memories he had long buried under routine and authority. In those quiet hours, Eleanor returned to him not as a ghost but as clarity. He remembered evenings when she had listened without interruption, as he spoke endlessly about deals and disputes, her eyes attentive, her responses measured. He had once taken pride in how little she needed from him, mistaking independence for detachment, never recognizing that she was choosing observation over reaction. Now, replaying those moments, he realized she had been mapping him, understanding not only his habits but his blind spots, the subtle arrogance that convinced him he could rearrange the world without consequence. That arrogance had been the foundation of his certainty, and it was precisely what Eleanor had built around, leaving it intact until it could no longer support him. As months turned into a year, Jonathan began to notice how often Eleanor's influence surfaced in places he could not avoid. News articles mentioned initiatives he once dismissed as insignificant. Conversations overheard in cafes referenced programs that quietly carried her signature values. Even the city itself seemed altered by her foresight, shaped by choices she had made without applause. Each mention felt less like punishment and more like instruction, as though Eleanor were teaching him a final lesson about permanence and humility, about how true control does not demand recognition to endure. Margaret, meanwhile, carried the responsibility Eleanor had entrusted to her with careful resolve. She refused public praise, declining interviews that attempted to frame Eleanor's story as revenge or scandal. Instead, she spoke only of intention and patience, emphasizing that the foundation existed not to correct a wrong, but to fulfill a vision. In private moments, Margaret often wondered whether Eleanor had known exactly how events would unfold, or whether she had simply prepared for every possibility. The answer, she suspected, lay somewhere between foresight and faith, a belief that truth, if preserved long enough, would eventually surface without force. Jonathan never attempted to challenge the outcome again. He understood that doing so would only confirm the very weakness Eleanor had anticipated. Instead, he accepted a quiet existence, working occasionally as a consultant under a different name, offering advice without authority. People listened, sometimes even respected him, but he no longer mistook attention for power. Each night, before sleep, He found himself thinking of the will, not the document itself, but the moment he believed it placed everything back into his hands. That moment now felt like the clearest evidence of how little he had truly understood. Years later, when Jonathan's health began to fail, he requested a single document from the Foundation's public archive, Eleanor's final letter, the one she had never intended him to read directly. Sitting by the window of his small apartment, he read it slowly, not searching for accusation but for meaning. The words were calm, almost gentle, explaining not why she acted, but how she chose to live with awareness, restraint, and preparation. She wrote not of betrayal, but of inevitability, reminding whoever read it that choices always echo beyond intention. When Jonathan finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it beside him. There was no dramatic realization, no sudden absolution, only a quiet acceptance that Eleanor had never tried to defeat him. She had simply refused to be erased. In the end, the secret change to the will had revealed far more than assets and clauses. It exposed the difference between possession and legacy, between dominance and understanding. Jonathan closed his eyes that evening, knowing that while he had altered a document in secret, Eleanor had shaped a future in plain sight. And that was the one detail he had never seen coming.